Let me ask you to imagine that you are a New York Police Department detective. A moment ago, you got a call on your cell phone. Uptown at 189th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue, there's a man with a gun pointed at the head of a 10-year-old boy. He's threatening to kill the kid, and maybe himself, unless he gets exactly what he wants. 30 police are there with guns pointing at the gunman's apartment window. You are in charge. You have to get up there and handle the situation. And as you race uptown, you have to be asking, what do I do? Students often ask me whether skilled negotiation can work with crazy, irrational people. And let's face it, if it can't help us deal with truly difficult people, then it's not worth much, especially because they're the people we most need help dealing with. But I know a group of people, negotiators, who regularly deal with others who are way crazier than anyone you and I ever are going to deal with. And that's the New York Police Department hostage negotiation team. Since the early 1970s, they've talked the man with the gun out of the building, gotten him to put the gun down, let the kid go, put his hands up, and come out, no one hurt. How? The secret of their success is in their motto, talk to me. And there it is. The most powerful negotiating skill of them all is highly disciplined, skilled listening. In this session, we'll look at what it takes to go from the way most people normally listen to the kind of listening that can make a profound difference for you and the trained negotiators who rely on it as a critical tool. And we'll look at specific tools and techniques and principles that together can make you much more effective doing many of the things we've explored so far in the course. So why is disciplined, skilled listening so valuable? I'll give you 5 reasons. First, it's one of the best ways to learn the other's interests and so find a creative solution. Second, one of the most universal interests people have is the desire to be heard. When you listen, it satisfies that interest and it costs you nothing. Third, it builds trust. Ever notice how good you feel about someone who really listens and lets you really confide in him? Confide comes from the Latin meaning to trust in. When you really listen, you literally build the other's confidence in you. Fourth, it's one of the best ways to cope. Losing it in the face of tough negotiation? Just listen. It centers you. It buys you time to think and process what's going on until your higher brain function kicks in. And fifth, it can help you successfully win the other's attention and consideration, even if you feel like you're powerless and he's Godzilla. Now, at this point, you may very well be thinking, wait a minute, Professor Freeman, are you about to lecture on how to listen? Don't you see the irony? I am listening, and you're right. But here's the thing. It's my fault, not yours, but right now, you are failing. You're failing. It's my fault because I am asking you to use the most ineffective kind of listening there is, passive listening. With passive listening, you simply nod your head and assume you've understood, and you haven't. Most of what you and I think we take in passively does not register, and you've probably known that since you were a child. You may very well recall the telephone game, a popular children's game. There, I whisper a nonsense message to the first person, who whispers it to the second, who whispers it to the third, and so on. When I ask the 10th person, what's the message? Her answer is usually unrecognizably different from the original message. Why? Because each person passively listened, thought she understood, didn't, passed her confusion on to the next person, and the confusion cascaded and amplified through the chain. It's so predictable that it's a fun parlor game, and adults have the same experience children have playing it. But in real life, that effect isn't so fun, and the confusion of passive listening tends to accompany other, even more insidious problems that can drive conflict. Let me illustrate with a simple demonstration. Picture 2 executives in tense conversation, Alan and Bob. Alan says to Bob, "Look, just because you're from headquarters doesn't give you the right to tell my staff how to spend its budget. Any requests for budget cuts have got to get my approval first, or there will be hell to pay. And Bob immediately replies, listen, you don't scare me. I have orders from the company president herself to get expenses down, whether you and your staff like it or not. Was there a conflict there? Sure sounds like it. But what are they really fighting over? Bob is sure he knows. This guy Alan obviously doesn't want to make the cuts. But is that really what Alan is saying? Did you catch it? Listen again. Alan says, just because you're from headquarters doesn't give you the right to tell my staff how to spend its budget. Any requests for budget cuts have to get my approval first, or there will be hell to pay. Alan never said he was opposed to the cuts. So what was he angry about? He was angry that Bob went behind his back and undermined Alan's authority. But Bob never got that point. How could he? He was passively listening. Worse, as soon as he heard what sounded like resistance, his ears shut down, his mental airbag exploded, and he began rehearsing mentally his great comeback line, and basically just waited for Alan to finish talking. Passive listening often turns into waiting for the other person to stop talking, which is really a counterfeit. Secret. People can usually tell that we're doing that, which often makes them a lot angrier. You know the feeling of being ignored? That's what it feels like. But what if someone had suggested this to Alan and Bob? How about if Alan tells his staff about the budget cuts himself? Alan would have accepted that idea since it recognizes his authority, and Bob would have accepted it because it got the message to the staff. So if passive listening is so ineffective, what can we do instead? Let me share two separate complementary listening methods that together can make a big difference. The first method is something I'll call dumb listening. By that I do not mean pretend you're stupid. Everyone knows you're not. What I mean is don't think a lot, don't talk a lot, and above all, don't mentally rehearse your reply while the other person is talking. Instead, focus squarely on the other person and just take in what he's saying. That would have helped Bob a lot to actually get what Alan was saying. But you might say, wait a minute, Professor Freeman, this sounds like a suicide pact. At work, for example, people are shouting at me and expecting me to reply immediately. If I go blank, they're going to stop talking, and I'll just stand there going, humana, humana, humana. But don't worry. Studies find the human mind can think up to 4 times faster than the human voice typically speaks. You'll have time to think of a very good reply. But if you don't slow down and focus on what the other person is really saying, you may very likely miss the point, further anger the other person, and lunge badly with an unhelpful reply that just makes things worse. That's what happened to Bob. But let's face it, how can we be sure that we really are understanding what the other person is saying? And for that matter, how can he be sure? That brings us to the second method, active listening. With active listening, you assume you don't fully understand, and to help confirm or clarify, you occasionally say back the gist of what the other person is saying. No, not robotically, not like a tape recorder, not like Rain Man, but every now and then you paraphrase, saying, let me just make sure I'm getting the basic idea here. Are you saying... Now, you may be familiar with active listening, and regardless, you may be thinking, frankly, Professor Freeman, I can't see how I'm going to be using active listening in an important negotiation or conflict, especially where the stakes are high and the pressure is on. People are pressing me and shouting at me, and when I'm in a stress situation like that, I simply don't have the time to use this active listening method, and that's a legitimate objection. So let's test it out. What I want to do now is share with you a brief conversation and invite you to consider what kind of listening is going on.
4200. Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. You're looking great. 2,000 feet. 2,000 feet. Into the ag, 47 degrees. Roger. 47 degrees.
Still looking very good.
Your go. Shot alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm. 1201 alarm. Same type, we're go, flight. Okay, we're go. We're go, same type, we're go.
Did you catch that? At several key moments, someone in the conversation said back what someone else said. Now think about it. Lives are at stake, and seconds are critical. So you would be perfectly within your rights to say, we can't afford the time to do this active listening stuff. But in situations like this, experienced professionals know the opposite is true. We can't afford not to, because we can't afford to misunderstand. It turns out that active listening is standard operating procedure in all commercial aviation and all space exploration. It's also the rule in the surgical theater between the doctor and the nurse. As you know, suture, suture, clamp, clamp, scalpel, scalpel. It's also the rule for securities brokers. They routinely say back the order that the client phones in, even when hundredths of a second count and millions of dollars are at stake. In fact, in almost all high-stakes professions, active listening is the rule. If it's true there, then maybe active listening can be useful to you and me in the high-stakes conflicts, transactions, and other negotiations that we're handling. To develop this idea, let me tell you a true story. It's a story that requires me to hint at what I bet is the most foul language any professor has ever alluded to in any of the great courses. But I ask for your kind permission to tell it here, because it illustrates a crucial idea we need if we're going to use these skills effectively and if we're going to deal well with extremely difficult people. It's a true story I call A Night at the Homeless Shelter. A young woman, approximately 90 pounds and about 5 feet tall, volunteered to work one night at a homeless shelter. The deal was that she was to sit behind the front desk and watch the residents as they slept in cots. She was to keep the bathroom keys and the sign-in book, and residents were allowed to stay only if they had signed in. It's 2:30 in the morning. She's all alone, and one of the residents comes to her desk. He's 6'10", 350 pounds, and he says, "Give me the bathroom key." "Certainly, sir. Have you signed in yet?" "No." "Well, sir, if you'll just sign in, I'll be happy to give you the bathroom key." "I'm not signing the blank, blank book." She's scared but maintains calm and says, "Well, sir, if you won't sign in, I can't give you the bathroom key. In fact, I can't allow you to be here. So won't you please sign in?" To which he replies, "Listen, blank, if you don't give me those blank, blank, blanking keys, I'm going to punch your blank, blank, blank and lights out." And she later wrote that she realized at that moment that if she didn't make it extremely clear that she understood exactly what he was saying, he was going to demonstrate the point. So no kidding, she said, "I get it. You're saying that if I don't give you these blank, blank, blank and keys, you're going to punch my blank, blank, blank and lights out, right?" And he replied, "Yeah." And he started to calm down. And this went back and forth like that for several minutes. And she said, "Sir, will you please leave?" And he did. Now, I'm not saying that if you're at a bank machine tonight and you hear a voice behind you that you should turn around and say, "So you're saying if I don't give you my money, you're going to shoot me?" I don't want to read about that in the paper tomorrow. But this remarkably brilliant woman dramatized something critical that we've got to get if we're going to deal well with others who seem irrational and furious. There's a world of difference between understanding someone and agreeing with him. Why do you suppose people are shouting at us? It's because they think we can't hear them. And they're right, we can't. When we're in a heated conflict, you and I don't go blind with anger. We go deaf with anger. We literally can't process what the other is saying. And guess what? The other can tell. So he figures if you can't hear me, then maybe if I shout, you will, which only makes you and me more freaked out and more deaf, and it becomes a vicious cycle. But this remarkable woman found a way to break that cycle and turn it around. She did it by actively listening, showing him that she understood so that there's no need to shout. Of course, she wasn't saying, "I agree with you. Oh, yes, please punch my lights out." But she was showing him she understood. And by addressing that profound interest in being heard, she diffused the situation, bought time, won some confidence, and invited the guy to reciprocate and begin to listen to her. Which may explain why the New York City Police Department hostage negotiation team's motto is "Talk to me." Because they realize that the guy with the gun probably is holding out because he's run out of ideas, of ways to get others to listen to him. The gun is the last idea he's come up with for getting that listening. Incredibly, the hostage negotiation team really does get this. They know the gunman's got a story to tell, and listening to it is key. They won't always agree with him. Yes, we'll give you anything you want, but they will listen. And that's a crucial way that you can raise the odds of getting even a seemingly crazy person to collaborate with you. To see how effective these ideas are, I want to share with you how my wife and I fight. What if I could predict with 91% accuracy whether your relationship with your significant other will survive? Would you be interested? It may well be possible. Researchers interviewed 135 couples who were about to be married and then followed their lives over the course of the next 12 years. They found that just by referring to the pre-marriage interviews, they could predict with 91% accuracy which couples would stay together and which would break up. What were the key predictors? Essentially, it was the things at play in the following scene. In this scene, imagine two young people, Lori and Leo, a young married couple, are just returning from a party. And Lori begins by saying, "You know, I really resented it at the party, the way you treated me in front of all of our friends." "The way I treated you? What are you talking about?" "About the ice cream? You act like you're my father or something. You have this need to put me down or control me." "Lori, I wasn't trying to hurt you. You said that you're on a diet, and I'm just trying to help you stick to it. You're so defensive. You hear everything as an attack on you, even when I'm trying to help." "Help? Humiliating me in front of my friends is your idea of helping? You know, I just can't win with you. If I say something, you think I'm trying to humiliate you. And if I don't, you ask me, why did I let you overeat? Sometimes I wonder whether you don't just start fights on purpose. I can't believe how stupid and pig-headed you are. Just keep your big mouth shut when we're out together next time. Let's hope you can keep your big mouth shut. Drop dead." That dialogue comes from the excellent book, Difficult Conversations, by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen. Lori and Leo dramatize the behaviors researchers identified as most predictive of a doomed relationship: escalation, negative interpretation, invalidation, and withdrawal. Now, dynamics like these are all too familiar to us, and it often seems as if that's just the nature of couples, the battle of the sexes, married life, call it what you will. But you now have a way, at least at the margin, to turn that vicious cycle around. It's something my wife and I call the fair fight rule. Similar processes have other names, such as dialogic listening. But in essence, all it is an agreement at the beginning of the conversation to mutually actively listen. So, one might say to the other as the fight starts to break out, "Okay, before we go further, let me suggest that we agree to a simple conversation ground rule so that I can be sure I understand what you're saying and you can be sure I'm being clear. You say anything you want me to hear for half a minute or so. Then I'll say back the gist of what you're saying. If I'm pretty much getting it right, you say so, and then it'll be my turn to speak for about the same amount of time, and you say back the gist of what I'm saying. Let's keep it going back and forth like that for a while, and let's agree that saying it back doesn't mean we're agreeing, it just means we're trying to understand. Then, after a while, we can see if we understand things well enough to help solve the problem. Do you want to give it a try?" The power of the fair fight rule is that it reverses the problems Lori and Leo got into. Instead of escalating, the rule tends to de-escalate the conflict. Instead of invalidating and negatively interpreting, you're simply listening and showing your understanding without judging one way or the other. Instead of withdrawing, you're engaging. Because you've both agreed in advance to follow the rule, there's no loss of face in genuinely trying to understand. And knowing that you, in effect, will have a test on this soon after, what the other one is saying can really make it easier and more intentional for you to focus and listen and give full attention. My wife and I have been amazed during the 11 years of our happy marriage how helpfully the fair fight rule has served us. But we're not alone. Marriage counselors routinely coach their couples, both before the wedding and when the marriage is in trouble, to listen to each other in a similar way. Now let me test your ability as a skilled listener and negotiator by doing a simple demonstration using a real-life story. In late 2001, a reporter for the New York Times interviewed the Grand Ayatollah of Iran to see if Iran would consider joining the United States in the coalition of the willing against terrorism. Here is a paraphrased summary of what the Ayatollah said. "You expect us to work with you, the great Satan? Outside of the United Nations, we will never cooperate with this heinous and criminal regime that has usurped Iranian sovereignty and brutalized our people for so long. Outside of multilateral channels, we will never collaborate with this most evil and despicable of states, which has acted with such hypocrisy and cruelty toward us for so many years." So what is the Ayatollah saying? Is he saying no? In fact, when U.S. officials read that interview, they said it was the best thing they'd heard coming out of Iran in 20 years. Why? If you listen carefully, you'll notice that the Ayatollah signaled he was open to working with the United States through third-party organizations. Of course, the tone sounded hostile. The Ayatollah's Iranian audience would have expected nothing less. But a skilled listener picks up cues that others would miss. Wharton professor Stuart Diamond says that if someone tells you, "I hate you," the best reply is, "Tell me more." I think he's right. Inviting the other to talk while you listen carefully is a vital way to buy time, slow down an emotionally charged situation, and perhaps discover what the other person is really saying and not saying. An advanced part of active listening is sometimes referred to as empathic listening or mirroring. Here, you reflect back occasionally the feelings you sense the other person is expressing. So, for example, Bob might say to Alan, "It sounds like you're really annoyed with how I communicated with your staff." In some situations, empathic listening can help the other negotiator feel that much more understood, while it better develops your own understanding. As New York Police Department hostage negotiator Dominic Messino puts it, if you're negotiating a curfew with your teenager, believe me, 95% of that conversation is about emotions. Rely solely on verbal content and you're going to be grossly misinformed. He adds that mirroring is a great way to build rapport and keep the conversation moving forward. Beyond these things, there are additional ways to listen that can foster better negotiating. As skilled hostage negotiators know, one very good way to help the other negotiator talk more is to use what are called minimal prompts, such as, go on, yeah, can you say more? And so forth. To enhance our own attentiveness and invite real sharing, we can also draw from the wisdom of counselors. They recommend a listening method that relies on a mnemonic called SOLER, S-O-L-E-R. Squarely face the other person, open your posture, lean toward him, make eye contact, relax. The power of the SOLER method lies in the way it helps you demonstrate physically to the speaker that you're fully engaged. Picture someone sitting legs crossed, turns away from you, glancing at his iPhone. Then picture someone attending to you much more intentionally. Who would you rather talk to? Now, some of the elements of the SOLER method are best suited for North American culture. Eye contact, for example, has a different meaning in some other cultures in some situations. But SOLER can be a starting point for intentionally considering the kind of body language that communicates that you are sincerely attending to the other person. Skilled question asking is closely connected to skilled listening. We've seen in an earlier session how it can foster real empathy. Now we can go further and see how it enhances real listening. Studies find that excellent negotiators not only listen better, they interrupt less and ask more questions than mediocre negotiators do. And often, The most simple questions foster the best listening and learning. In fact, to be a skilled listener summons us to fight the fear of looking dumb, and to do it by being willing to ask dumb questions, such as, percentage of what? And when you say inspection, what do you mean? In fact, I will argue that you and I face a serious danger as negotiators precisely because of our educations. Often we don't want to admit to others, especially other negotiators, that we don't understand what they're talking about. We don't want to look dumb. That very impulse, the fear of looking dumb, may be one of the more dangerous experiences we can have as negotiators. Let me show you how dangerous it can be. During the 1990s, Fortune magazine found that one of the most respected companies in America was Enron. But in 2000, one of Fortune magazine's own reporters, Bethany McLean, asked Enron CEO Jeffrey Skilling, "How do you make money?" Skilling laced into her, calling her names and questioning her intelligence and her integrity. She stuck to her guns and a few months later published in Fortune magazine an article entitled, "Is Enron Overpriced?" The first such article in a major publication. Turns out Enron was smoke and mirrors and wasn't making any money at all, and Jeffrey Skilling was sentenced to federal prison for 25 years for massive fraud. Afterwards, Bethany McLean was asked what she'd learned. "It was strange," she explained. "I asked the same question of Wall Street analysts, and they replied, 'That's a good question. If you find out how Enron makes money, will you let us know, please?' 'But you're recommending the stock,' she said. 'Yes,' they said, 'but it's complicated.'" McLean concluded that often the most powerful question is the one that seems most stupid. And there it is. Our fear of looking dumb can drive impasse and confusion and leave us vulnerable to being taken advantage of by others. Now, all this is not to say that we should always reveal ignorance, but it's a strange fact that the more prepared you are, the more comfortable you tend to be asking dumb questions. It might surprise you to learn that the power of asking simple questions and listening carefully is well known to salespeople. Conventional wisdom holds that salespeople are fast-talking wheeler-dealer types who want to qualify you and close you as quickly as possible. Yet in fact, one of the most well-known sayings in sales contradicts that point. Telling ain't selling. I've actually experienced the truth of that saying firsthand. Years ago, a large bank asked me to propose a training for them. I came in with an elegantly bound packet of detailed materials for each of them, and I spent 45 minutes regaling them with stories about my work and my experience, and they seemed enthralled and happy to hear everything I had to tell them, and I never heard from them again. But later, as I learned to ask questions and listen, a large percentage of interested firms asked me to work with them. I'm not alone. Studies find that the more a salesperson talks, the less she tends to close sales. The more she lets the customer talk, the more she wins the sale. For several decades, one of the most widely respected sales methodologies has been one developed by Neil Rackham, a social scientist whose excellent research on negotiation we'll encounter later. Rackham calls his approach spin selling. The word spin is a bit unfortunate because it sounds a bit like misleading double talk, but actually it's quite the opposite. Rackham's approach teaches salespeople to ask questions and listen early on for four things: the customer's situation, her problems, what the implications of the problem are, and finally, the needs these implications create. It's a surprisingly slow-paced, centered, customer-focused approach that emphasizes carefully listening to the client so much that it takes a while even to ask specifically about her needs. Rackham has found that by listening for and asking about these things, a salesperson not only builds trust, rapport, and knowledge and insight, she also encourages the customer to in effect explain how to win the sale. She also encourages the customer to become more interested in the solution the salesperson is offering, and do it in a low-key, humble, no-pressured way. Skilled negotiators also watch for clues that the other person doesn't feel heard. Is he saying the same thing over and over? Does he feel shut down and wary? They also listen even more attentively to criticism and objections, knowing that these things often reveal interests which reveal potential solutions, as we've seen. So here's a simple way to practice the critical skill of active listening the next time you're in an important conflict or negotiation. I call it the exactly challenge. See what happens if 2 or 3 times during the conversation you paraphrase what the other person is saying so accurately that the other person says exactly, or words to that effect. What does it take to do that? And what effect does it have on the conversation? No guarantees, but as many of my students have reported, very often it produces dramatic improvements. Let me also challenge you to try the fair fight rule before your next fairly serious disagreement, which is basically an agreement at the start that both of you will do the exactly challenge, in turn as the other speaks for about 30 to 60 seconds at a time. See what a difference it can make for you. Lastly, try fighting the fear of looking dumb by intentionally asking simple questions in the next conflicts and negotiations you have, and then listening dumbly and actively to the answers. Listening is a remarkably powerful and persuasive skill, a soft source of power that we usually don't think of as a source of power at all. But there's another soft source that can dramatically change your bargaining position, your understanding of what's fair, and your persuasiveness. So much so that negotiators may spend as much time on it before the talks as anything else, and that is research. We'll explore its value and uses and how to do it more effectively in our next session.